Hey, welcome to the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. This is lesson 84. We've got a big block on positional targets at the team position level, of course, and maybe some estimations as to what we might expect in 2021. I think I've got 16 video lessons coming at you here in this block. So sit back and let's get you ready to crush 2021. Of course, this is trying to help you win your fantasy football drafts. It's about 60% or so of the game, at least in my experience. Okay, let's continue. This is year, running back, tight end, wide receiver, average of total targets. So this is average of total targets for all of that position. We're talking, fifth, sixth level players as well as the tops. So just kind of a big scaled version here. I colorized as well to kind of see where things are happening for us. So let's do running backs. So this is from 2015 to last year. We saw a drop in targets. And again, this could be COVID related, or take a look in 2016 is about the same level 2020. So before last year, we actually had, a nice season of running back targets, and that kind of blew up for us in 2020. It's a little bit hard to predict what we're going to see. The average is about 23 targets, and this is per season, right? This is not per game, obviously. And so, not sure what we're going to get. Uh, it's hard to guess. It's not like there's, a pattern here. Uh, I'm Hopefully we won't drop below that, but I'm not sure we're going to see, uh, you know, numbers that are going to make that be much different. Tight ends, the golden age of the tight ends in the last 6 years was 17, 16, and 2015. 34, 32%. I'm sorry, 32 targets per average for tight ends at the position. And last year we saw 29. So we've dropped and had a drop since 2018. So again, looks like targeting has gone down, or the teams. And again, another way to look at this data is maybe there's just more running backs and tight ends getting a target or two, and that's kind of skewing the overall average data. But that's another possibility, as well as teams are using more situational players here, which could be wide receivers. The best years were 15, 16, and 17. Okay. We're talking 48, 49 up to almost 55. And last year was 47. So 2020 was a below average for all the positions here. And it's been the worst total target average in the last 6. So is that just more players getting a little bit? This could be a COVID phenomenon, but 2019 wasn't so strong for some of the positions as well. So uh, there may be a shift in offense, in the fact that maybe more players are going to have a little bit of a role, whereas in the past that was not so much the case. So just kind of keep that in mind. There may be some kind of a shift that way. And for daily fantasy sports, what that could mean would be some of these obscure players are popping up on occasion and doing well, and then they're gone again. So that might make it, your research little more difficult here to try to, figure that out. So I think that's how I would look at that. So I'm bearish on the average target of running back, tight end, and wide receiver. Again, probably, and I haven't got the numbers yet, but I'm assuming that this was either COVID or we're just, and that could have been, and adding more players that are getting a little bit more activity than usual, which is interesting. So actually, that might be. Now that I think about it, again, I'm reacting to this data in real time. I never, uh, have a script or anything. It's just how I'm reacting at the time. But that hits me that figuring out deep handcuffs might be a little easier if you spot a player getting some activity. That may, be something to consider in an injury to a top player in that group. So that may make it a little bit more obvious as to who the deeper handcuffs are. So it could help us. So let's flip it and say that could help us. So that's what I'm going to keep in the back of my mind. And I definitely follow targets every week. And I look to see, especially the extremes, the deeper, ones, the rare players that are popping up, try to figure out what's going on. So I keep that in mind. Uh, League positional targets by year. So I drafted, or I'm sorry, I plotted this here and figured out polynomial trend lines. And this is red is the running back, orange, or I guess that's yellow, is tight end, and then of course wide receivers will always have more targets. But what I think is interesting was that tight ends in 15, 16, and maybe even 17 were a little higher than running backs, but the tight ends have dropped, and the running backs have gone up a little bit, but the tight ends have kind of dropped down to that. This is orange is the overall average targets, and you could see the last few years, the last 3 years, we're at a different level, and COVID even dropped that further here than the first, this period of time in 15 and 16, 17. So just keep this in the back of your mind. Just visualize this. And notice the difference here in wide receivers to tight ends. And it looks like that's closed, been a lot closer as well. So it's very, very intriguing to me. Curious to see how that plays out. So positional wise, here's running backs, tight ends, and wide receivers. So one possibility was we're getting more players that are getting a target. Okay, so what does the data say about that? We have the year, the count of players, should be with the S there, my bad. Count of players, sum of total targets, and average of targets for wide receivers per game. And notice that 2020, this really jumps out. 151 running backs got a target, and the preceding years, 19 and 18, were less than that. So we did have a higher amount of running backs getting targets, but the sum of the targets did drop as well. So it wasn't just that there's more running backs and the same targets. 3,284 targets versus the preceding 3 years. It's 36 and 35. So 2020 was a down year, even though there was a lot more running backs in play, probably for COVID. The total targets actually dropped. So the offenses were not producing across the league more running back targets. So that can have an effect in PPR leagues. Okay. So just be aware of that. And it dropped. The average was 2.3 average per game versus 2.5, 2.8, 2.5, 2.4. Only in 2015 did we have that 2.3 target per game. So we really dropped in total targets. So that is intriguing to me. Tight ends. Look at the count of players. Tight ends have definitely gone up in the number of tight ends the whole league is using here. Looks like in 18, 19, and 20, if you remember the previous 15, 16, 17 had the best average, but notice they had the least amount of tight ends. So it was a clear break. 2018, something happened and the light switch went on, and now they're having more tight ends receiving a target. So be aware, especially in the depth of tight ends. So I think that makes Kelsey and some of these other highly targeted tight ends maybe even more precious than before. I've been trying to not wait as late as I've done in the past for some deep tight ends. If I have to, then I'm obviously streaming, and that just adds stress to you. But you got to do what you got to do. And the number of targets has declined since 15 and 16. Look at that, 38, 37. We're at 36. 2018, 33. So that was the low point right there. And we're at 3.8 targets. So the average tight end is getting almost 4 targets a game. On average, again, I know there are some that are getting a lot more than that. But we're just kind of looking across at average. So I think the running backs are different in the fact that teams, at least last year, were targeting them less. Maybe COVID, maybe. So just remember then that if we have another run of lots of COVID, then I think we're going to see less targets to the running backs. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head here. Wide receivers, notice that the last 3 years we've had a lot more wide receivers. So something happened in 2018 that tight ends and wide receivers. So I think the league is going into passing, and we see more wide receivers getting a target or two. Of course, like I said, one side that hurts us because that means, the pie's being split. But injury handcuffs may be a little more apparent than in previous years. So it's a yin and yang here. Total number of targets, though, in the COVID year actually went up in 2020 versus the preceding 3 years. So that was interesting, completely different than the running backs. The average is around 2, so we were about 1.9, a little bit below. So I think tight ends and wide receivers seem to show less of a COVID effect than running backs. And that may be something about the skills needed to catch out of the backfield versus blocking. Not every depth crew of running backs maybe is good at catching targets out of the backfield. So kind of keep that in mind, that those may be more precious than we realize here. That's my thinking now as I look at this data. So I'm not expecting drops in tight ends or wide receivers from what we saw last year. But the running back position does concern me if we have another serious COVID outbreak there. Okay. So that surprised me. I wasn't predicting that, and I haven't heard anybody talk about that. Y'all heard anybody? No. But you're hearing it here. So hopefully the few of you that's listening, good for you. You get that, at least put you in a mindset to consider things. Other people are surprised and like, where'd that come from? Okay. I hate to be surprised. Hate to be surprised. And here is just the overall average of targets. I just wanted to look across here. And like I said, tight ends, really not a big change. Wide receivers, but the running backs did drop in the COVID. So I think we saw that in total targets, and I think we're seeing that in the average targets per running back there. And I just show you the logarithmic trend lines here of all these. Notice the wide receivers, of course, are getting more, but over time they're dropping down over the 6 years of targets here, and then the from 2015 to 2020 here, the wide receivers and the running backs, it just showed that there's not a normal distribution of targeting. And so that always makes it, when you're having to convert data to logarithmic or other kinds of trend lines, polynomial, then that probably shows it's not normally distributed at all. So that makes a little bit the metrics a little more confounding here. And there's the 0 point. And I'm not seeing really anything dramatic. I will say that the tight ends have dropped. If you look at the total tight ends below wide receivers and running backs as far as across the league average there. Okay. So running back scale targets, tight end, and wide receivers. Here it is. If we look now, again, we're not doing any trend lines, just looking at the players. So from the highest running backs, the ones that were doing the targets, to the lowest. So you can see that the top wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends are all skewed. In other words, the lines want to say this should be it, but see, you're seeing this increase here. So what's happening is on the top end of any of these positions as far as targeting, they're all skewed and not normally distributed. Teams are finding these abnormal extreme players and really using them, and they're collecting a lot more targets than the rest. You can see after the top 5 or so, if you look at this line here, the top 5, and maybe it's a little bit top 6, maybe top 6, top 5, you're really starting to see, and you do see this slow decline. And the skew is that the tight ends and running backs fall together. And again, wide receivers, they're all going to collect more targets than the other. And that's just predictable. And so that makes wide receivers as a group more valuable than the tight ends and the running backs, except for these top 5, 6, 7 players. So you've got to kind of think about those players out there as something, it's like something different than the rest. And you can look at almost at a certain point where it really doesn't change. You can almost see these, these drops here. People might call that tiers. And so when people tier, what they're trying to do is mimic this kind of collection of players, right? They're all kind of about the same in this group here. And so tiering, I like that, and it does have its place. But just remember, that's what they're trying to do for you. And you'll notice a lot of times the tiers get really crowded, and it almost doesn't work at the end because you've got so many. And so the tiers really are more helpful in the beginning than the end of players. So just whenever, if you don't use my tiers, anybody's tiers, just realize what they're trying to mimic here and think about this graph a little bit. I looked at the ratio of tight ends to running backs in the top 100 of each over the years. And the data is very, 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 can I say noisy? Very noisy. And so when you compare those two, even though they're close together, there's a lot of variation over the last 6 years. And notice that in the top, group here, the top 10 or 20, we're getting a cluster. And then after that point, we're getting, and then you get these here that are really skewed out. And so the further you go, the more kind of wacky it gets. So there's the top tight ends and wide receiver running backs are kind of together. But at a certain point, you lose that, and it becomes really wacky and probably hard to predict at a certain point. So it's kind of like tier. Once you get to a certain point, the tiers are not telling you anything. People will put them out there. Here's tier 13. Probably at that point, it's irrelevant, and there's going to be so much variation. So I look at early tiers in anybody's rankings. If I do look, I pretty much don't, but if you do, then I would look at earlier and just assume they're going to be notice the distance here is a lot of variation compared to early. So not as much variation, lots of variation here. And this is, of course, after the fact this is the end of the season. So realize it really gets wacky, especially probably for your deep tight ends. It's just so wacky compared to running backs. Notice, on the other hand, when you look at wide receivers versus running backs, wide receivers are almost very uniform and tightly packed together, and not a lot of variation compared to running backs. So tight ends are really skewed after probably 20 of them, but wide receivers pretty much are packed together. It looks like about 45 in, they start getting a little bit. Notice the distance here versus look at this distance almost. And so it gets really choppy This is, if you think of this variation, so it gets really variable at about the 45th, so close to the fourth level of wide receivers. After that point, you're going to get a lot more variation. So just be aware when people are ranking care, they're not that damn good. Okay, there's too much variation here. And again, think about the tight ends trying to get all their variation after the 20. This is saying after. So at a certain point in your draft, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's becoming a roll of the dice. So doesn't mean you shouldn't have put a lot of time in, but I would track how good you are at picking that, needle in the haystack, especially late running backs and late wide receivers. If you're that good, then you really are going to have an advantage over a lot of people in your league if you're good at picking in the choppier waters here. And you look at the wide receivers, and again, it's just saying compared to tight ends, it's really, get a little choppiness early. So what that means is the tight ends early, the top 5 or 10 tight ends and wide receivers, there's a lot of variation. Then it smooths out, and then it gets wacky again. And so it's hard to predict when you're looking at the wide receivers after about the 45th wide receiver here. But realize that the tight ends are a lot of variation between their relationship with wide receivers. So what that's saying is that tight ends that are in the top group can overcome and be as good as some wide receivers in the top group. And I think somebody like Kelsey Waller, that's why people are really valuing those, because it's kind of like having a wide receiver, especially in a PPR league. And the ones I play in, Waller and Kelsey are going early, because I think people have decided those guys are falling this year into this kind of area, and you have an opportunity to beat some of these usually dependable wide receivers. So, but at a certain point, the magic does play out, and you're not getting any advantage on average. And like I said, really deep into wide receivers, you're getting a lot of choppiness and a lot of variation. And that becomes really hard. Like I said, regardless of what so-called experts will tell you, after a certain point, me too. I'm guessing. I mean, maybe educated guess. Maybe I'm using other things, and I do. And I try to use team tendencies and whatnot to try to know that I'm fishing in these choppy waters. So that's one way that I handle it. Okay, is I try to apply other metrics, especially late in a draft. Okay, that's my 10-cent tour of the overall, and we'll come back. Like I said, I got 16 lessons, so I guess I got 15 more. Oh, goodness. So come back. This is the process. This is Dr. John Bush. We're having lots of fun.